him out until morning. Despite the pounding of his heart and the gasping of his breath, the runner was joyous. What he had heard earlier this morning, at first by thinking it was mere dreaming by women delirious with grief, he now knew as truth. Jesus was alive. The promise did live. The runner turned toward the west just in time to see the late afternoon sun touch the horizon. Darkness would soon envelop the entire land, and the Jerusalem gates would be locked fast. He started again, only now the running seemed easier. Those first miles from Emmaus had been rough. The narrow path rutted by the hooves of countless sheep. But he was on the main road now, the high ridge road leading directly to the great Damascus gates. This was the trade route, smoothed through the centuries by legions of soldiers and Jewish pilgrims that constantly streamed to Jerusalem to visit the great temple. Now that the running was easier, he had time to think. Had it only been 3 days since the master had been snatched while praying in the garden? Betrayed by one of their very own? It seemed so much longer than 3 days. An eternity, really. Only 3 days since he'd been hauled like a common criminal before the great high priest and then the governor, until finally, as tempers ran hot and daylight creased the eastern sky, the Roman order had been given. Crucify. How could it be? What had Jesus possibly done that could warrant the cross, Rome's most horrific form of execution? The runner knew the accusations were false. His master could never be a traitor to the state or a destroyer of the faith. And yet still, that had been the verdict. The punishment pounded out by iron nails into innocent hands and feet. Hanging on a cross as his life slipped away, he was taunted by the priest, mocked by the guards, his last belongings taken in a game of dice as a soldier's right of conquest. In the pain of his last hour, his voice barely audible now, the runner had heard him whisper, "It is finished." With the Sabbath now beginning, his body was released from the cross, hastily wrapped in cloth and carried into a borrowed tomb. The once vibrant healer was now lifeless, laid on a slab of stone to grow cold. As sundown came, a huge boulder was rolled into place to seal the tomb. Again, the runner remembered those haunting words, "It is finished." So what was left? The promise of the kingdom was broken, like so many bones scattered over the hill of Golgotha. Nothing was left. Truly, it was finished. The runner remembered it all as he continued his way along the ridge road that led to the city. Jesus had implied such an end, warning his followers even as they sat around the table Thursday evening. Oh, what a sweet communion that had been. A time of joyful Passover, yet strangely intertwined with sadness. Never again would it be the same. Never again would Jesus be so near. Never again would the runner hear his words of blessing. Indeed, it is finished. It was this painful finality that had led the runner and his friend to leave the city earlier that very morning. Why stay, they wondered. There's nothing left for us here. Nothing but memories and pain, nothing but broken dreams. As they were saying their goodbyes, a couple of the women from their group ran in, babbling a story of an empty tomb and conversations with angels. "Don't play with our emotions," they shouted. "He is dead. You know this. You were there yourself." And so they left Jerusalem, hearts heavy, feet slow, to begin the long walk home, back to Emmaus, back to the lives they had led before Jesus. Remembering, the runner stopped again to try and catch his breath. It was almost evening now. With the city walls just barely visible in the distance, he knew he would be too late. The gates would be locked. Breathing hard, he pushed on, spurred by what he remembered had happened next. It had been around noon on their journey toward Emmaus. A third man had joined them as they walked along. At first they hadn't noticed, lost and intent as they were in their own thoughts. But there he was, keeping step with them. Hesitant at first, they began to talk, slowly beginning to share what weighed most heavily on their hearts. The stranger appeared unaware. "Well, you must be the only one in all of Jerusalem not to know of Jesus' death," they told him. And so they shared what they knew. Stories of love and peace, of miracles and healings, of prophecies and promises. The excitement of the memory stirred their hearts with fire and quickened their steps. Arriving in their hometown, Emmaus, they extended an invitation. "It's late. You should stop and rest. You can break bread with us tonight." And so it happened. 7 miles outside the holy city, in the village of Emmaus, just before the late afternoon sun touched the horizon and slipped into the evening, truth touched their lives and slipped into their presence. Sitting down together to share a meal, the stranger took bread and broke it. Passing it to them, there was a flicker of recognition. The Passover table just days earlier rushed back to them in quick remembrance, and suddenly the stranger was gone. But hope was resurrected. Jesus was alive. And now the runner approached the high, dark walls of Jerusalem, outlined by the occasional watchfires. As he had known it would be, the Damascus gate was shut tight. He searched along the wall until he found the maze gate, the one that was so small it was often called the Needle's Eye, a small zigzag passage through which only one man could enter at a time. "I must come in," the runner shouted through. A guard's voice called back, seeking name and reason for entrance. "I have news," the runner answered. "It is a matter of life and death." Granted passage, the runner inched his way through the opening and then through the deserted streets to the steps that led to the upper room. He could hear voices inside, familiar voices. His knocking brought a sudden silence. He knocked again, louder, and shouted his name and how he had run all the way from Emmaus. The door cautiously unlatched, and the runner pushed his way in, shouting the news even as he arrived. "He is alive! He is alive! We've broken bread with the risen Christ. He is alive. The promise lives." Indeed, he is alive. This is a true story, and it's a story that you can find and read for yourself in the 24th chapter of Luke's Gospel. I have to admit I embellished it a little bit with just some simple imagination. As I thought about the story this week and sought to write a sermon, I just felt the story was enough on its own. It held its own weight. It's an amazing story, a true story. And today we're going to share in Holy Communion, and I want us to be able to center like those followers did on the presence of Christ, which is at the very heart of this sacred meal, this sacred experience we share together. There's some poignant verses in this story that underscore this reality. So I decided I would share it for you straight from Scripture. Now, to give you a little background before I read it, it's Easter morning when this scripture takes place. It's Easter morning, and the women have gone to the tomb. They've gone, if you'll remember the story, because there had not been time to properly anoint Jesus' body because of Sabbath. And so they had gotten up early on Sunday morning. They had waited through Saturday, through Sabbath. They had gotten up early Sunday morning, gone to the tomb with their oils, their spices, their ointments, and they had found the tomb empty. And of course, there were angels that were standing there. They thought they were guards, but the angels reminded them that Jesus had predicted this and that Jesus had risen. And now this is exactly where we'll pick up in Scripture. I'll be beginning with verse 9. So they, meaning the women, they rushed back from the tomb to tell his 11 disciples and everyone else what had happened. Now this was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the Mary mother of James, and several other women who told the apostles what had happened. But the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it. That same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles outside Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and appeared walking with them. But God kept them from recognizing him. He asked, "What are you discussing? What were you discussing so intently as you walked along?" They stopped short, sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened here in the last few days." "Well, what things?" Jesus asked. "The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles. He was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and of all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some women from our group of followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them that Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, the body was gone, just as the women had said." Jesus then said to them, "You foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures? Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory?" Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. By this time they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey. Jesus acted as if he were going to go on, but they begged him, "Stay the night with us, since it is getting late." So he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and at that moment he disappeared. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked to us on the road and explained the scriptures to us?" And within the hour, they were on their way back to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 disciples and the others who had gathered with them, who said, "The Lord really has risen. He appeared to Peter." Then the 2 from Emmaus told their story also of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they had recognized him as he was breaking the bread. When Jesus was at the table with them, he had taken the bread, he had blessed it like he had at that Passover meal, and then he had given it to them. And in that moment, the scripture tells us, their eyes